again, and I can delete this from my page. And I already had 2 hellos. All right. Are we live yet? All right. It says we are live on Facebook. Sorry, guys. So hello, everybody. We're going to start again. We started on my personal page, and I had promised to do it on the Call to Peace Ministries page. So welcome. We are heading towards the end of May in our May Day campaign, and attorney Tiffany Lesnik, who is on our board at Call to Peace Ministries, offered to get on and do a little Q&A with us, and also she has a challenge for us. So Tiffany, tell us a little bit about who you are, and also I'm going to just go right from there and tell us a little bit about your story and why you're so passionate about helping domestic abuse survivors.
Sure. So I am a family law attorney here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I practice specifically or primarily in the areas of family law. That's all that I do. I have my own practice, and about 95% of my practice is high conflict custody and domestic violence. I am very passionate about domestic violence and high conflict custody. I also do a lot with sexual abuse and child abuse cases, because I am a survivor of domestic violence myself. I haven't been able to talk about it a lot because my children are just now 22 and 18. So I've been under a court order to not really talk about my story. And so now I finally can share my story with my colleagues and other folks to hopefully help them. I believe that you should share your story. I think it inspires others. That's a motto that we have here in our office. But basically, I was in an abusive marriage for over 13 years. And my spouse was not necessarily physically violent, but was really on that border. He would do things like punch holes in the walls, break things, throw chairs, throw furniture around when he got angry. If we did not live up to his expectation of what he wanted, he would break things that were of great value to us. I remember one night we were sitting eating dinner, and my daughter wasn't eating quietly enough for him. So he took a toy that meant a great deal to her, picked it up at the dinner table, and smashed it into pieces. He would also do things like wake us up in the middle of the night, like all 3 of us, pack our bags, throw them over the railing, and then tell the children, this is all your mother's fault. And call me horrible names in front of them and tell us to get out and throw us out and things of that nature. So, right on that borderline, I would consider it physically violent as a domestic law attorney. But it was constant, daily kind of tirades that he would do. So as I am a Christian, I am proud to be a Christian, and it was something that I prayed about for a long time, and it was like, God, what do you want me to do with this situation? I really feel like I need to get out. I'm in danger. I believe my children are in danger. So I started reading a lot of books. I did a lot of praying, and then I really felt convicted that I needed to serve in order to really hear what God was telling me to do. And so I started teaching in a Sunday school class. I did that for 3 years, got really involved in my church. And then that's when I started reaching out to the church and saying, this is what's happening. What should I do? And the message was clear that what you needed to do was love him more and pray more. And I was very distraught by that message, because I just didn't feel, the more that I loved him, the worse it got. And so I didn't feel like that was really where God was calling me. And so at that point in my life, I had an opportunity to apply to law school. And I decided that was something that I was going to do. I needed to be financially independent for me and my children. And I went to my pastor, told him I was thinking about doing that. And he said, I don't think you should apply to law school. I think that you need to focus on your marriage, put law school on the back burner, and then when everything is well, then you can pursue a career and a profession. And I knew if I did that nothing was going to change. It was just going to get worse for me and my girls. So again, I prayed about it. I was constantly the doubting Thomas. Is this Should I put this on the back burner, or is this something I should do? And I was very frustrated because I'm like, God, why are you not answering my prayers? And on February 28th of 2008, he answered my prayers loud and clear. And that following weekend, my littlest, Megan, had decided to accept Christ as her Lord and Savior, but we did not tell her father when we came home from church. He did not go to church with us. And that following morning before school, she was really excited and she wanted to tell him. And he woke up in a horrible mood. And I said, Megan, this is not a good time. Please don't tell your dad. We'll tell him another time. And she was determined that she was going to tell him. And she went into the bedroom and said, Daddy, Daddy, I have this exciting news. And she went in to tell him. And in a moment, I know all the women out there and some men can relate, the veins in the neck and the face, everything just changed. And he came after us, started calling, me horrible names, started screaming, throwing things. I grabbed both my girls. I said, get in the car, we're going to school. He came after me, jumped on top of my car, started banging his fist into my window with such force that I thought my windows were going to break. And I told him, please get off my car. If you don't get off my car, I'm going to back up, which I eventually had to do. He then, we live in Wake Forest at the time, and my children went to school in downtown Raleigh. And he got into his car. It was like a 300C, which is a huge horsepower car. And I had a little Mitsubishi Montero. And he came after us on the highway, came peeling after us. It would not back up. And the girls were screaming in the back, thinking that he was chasing us down, essentially, that he was going to kill us. And they were screaming and they were crying. And so we were met. I called the police, and we were met at their elementary school by 5 police officers where he was detained. And my daughters had to watch as their father was detained by law enforcement. And so that day, on February 28, 2008, I took my children, my car, my keys, and my purse. I left and I never went back. And to me, it was clear that day, after all that praying, that it became an issue of faith, where my daughter accepted Christ and he acted like that. That was a clear message that I was to leave. And I did.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you got out, and I see a comment. It says a couple of comments here. Love him more, pray more. That's what I heard as well. What it means really is to enable him more, and that's what I found out. And the thing for me was, I thought, so many times, as a counselor, I've heard other counselors give them this counsel: just submit, pray, stay, and obey, is what my friend Julie Owen says. And we know that it actually empowers their sin.
Yes.
It makes it so much worse. So we know that doesn't work. And Lynn says, powerful story. So sorry you've been through all of that. So,
well, I'm glad for the story, because it's made me the person I am today, and it enables me to help so many more women that were in my situation. And one of the things I also found is there's nothing you can do right? So it doesn't matter what you do. Everything is wrong. And so the only thing that you can do is change yourself and who you are and make decisions for your life, and not for them. So, but anyway, so I'm a lawyer today, and I'm able to use my experiences with domestic violence to empower my clients today. And, that's a powerful testimony.
It is. And once you get to a certain point, it takes a while to heal. It really does. And you have to work on your healing. But once you get to a certain point, I can actually look back now 25 years later and say, boy, I'm grateful that I went through that. Now, I wouldn't want to have to ever go through it again, but I know that it's changed me in a much better way. My relationship with God before, I think, was very superficial. But when it's like Corey Ten Boom said, you'll never know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have, because it seemed like there was no system that was in place for me. My church didn't know how to handle it. Nobody really knew how to handle it. So Jesus was all I had, and he was enough. And so that's a pretty amazing thing. So we can look back and see that God used it for good, and he certainly has in your life.
Yeah. I see Esther says, I was told my family to suffer like Christ did. And I think Leslie Vernick points out in her book, The Destructive Marriage, is that, Christ died. He came to pay the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. And we are not called to do the same thing. right? We're not called to be Christ. He already did that for us.
Right.
So we're really called to come and be a vehicle for him, but not to be him. And so unfortunately, you received that message from the church, but I don't think that's our role as Christians or as human beings on this earth. And it doesn't matter what faith you're in. You know, you don't have to be Christian. You can be Muslim, Hindu, or Jewish, or any other faith. But I think faith is really important to folks. And I think is another reason why with the stay-at-home orders that are in place with coronavirus right now, and that's part of why we're here to talk about today, why it's been such a struggle for folks with who are suffering from domestic violence, is they can't access what they need from their faith-based homes, churches, mosque, synagogues, that kind of thing, because they're closed.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me that when we get that kind of counsel from our churches, they're acting like that is the most loving thing to do. But one thing that God really woke me up and showed me was you are not loving him well when you are just sitting by and allowing him to sin against you over and over and over again. So it's not even the most loving thing to do. And you're right, we're not the savior. We are not meant to save him from his sins, but we could at least say no to his sin and then leave him to God and put him in God's hands. You know, what that means for the marriage, you know, we don't know. We're not here to promote divorce, but we know that a lot of times that it may be where it ends up. In my case, I never even filed for divorce. I just had a legal separation, and he's the one that finally filed. But you know, we leave that to your personal convictions at Call to Peace Ministries. But it's always a good idea to talk to an attorney, just to find out what your legal rights are, because I've seen so many women, because we work primarily with women, lose so much because of advice their churches have given them, like, you can't get a legal separation. I've seen that happen. And then in the meantime, funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars, are moved out of accounts. And then these women are left destitute because no longer does that money exist. And, you know, and the advice of the church was you can't file for a legal separation. So it's always a good idea to have an attorney on board. And so I just want to say, yeah. And so
add to that, Joy, like I have a lot of people who will call my office, and especially faith-based people call my office, and it's like talking to me, or they're terrified because they think I'm, you know, some kind of tyrannical beast. I'm a lawyer. But the bottom line is, you know, I come from a faith-based perspective too, and there are other attorneys that are out there that don't wish you harm and don't wish you destruction. They wish you well, and they wish for you to prosper. And so I think you need to have knowledge in order to protect yourself and your children. And just calling for a free consultation, there are a lot of attorneys out there that give free consultations, and just giving you some advice about what happens if you leave the home. What kind of support are you entitled to? Should you take your children with you? And the answer to that question is always yes, by the way. But, you know, what kind of things do you need to worry about as far as property distribution, custody, support? Those are not, you should not be taking advice from clergy or other lay persons about those issues. That needs to come from a professional, and that is going to be an attorney, because the advice that you're taking could have very serious long-term implications, not just for yourself, but for your children.
Yeah. And I don't really think that the churches mean to do harm, but what a lot of times they do is they elevate marriages above lives, and they forget about the well-being and so inadvertently, and I did it years ago, so I'm not here to bash churches, but inadvertently their counsel ends up hurting them, especially from a legal and financial perspective. So tell me a little bit about why you ended up getting involved with us at Call to Peace Ministries. Why is that important to you?
Oh, because I believe that people's faith is important to them. And I don't want women, and I use the term women just because the majority of victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, tend to be women. So I use that term loosely. I do recognize that there are men that are victims of domestic violence. So I hope I'm not offending anybody. But I do believe that faith is a central component to many people's lives. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of folks who torn away from the faith as a result of the abuse that they've suffered and some of the advice they've gotten from the church, or being re-victimized by the church.
Yes.
And so I've gotten involved with Called to Peace because I believe in what the organization is doing, by bringing victims back to the faith and saying, it's not God or Christ who's victimizing you or who's abusing you. I mean, we're all humans, right? So none of us is perfect, and sometimes we get imperfect advice, even from church members, clergy, people in power. But ultimately, Christ is the one who desires to have a relationship with you. Above all, he came and paid the ultimate sacrifice. And he's really the one that's going to get you through these horrific experiences. And so that's why I really wanted to be involved with Called to Peace Ministries, to remind folks that, their faith was the central component, to basically holding them up in some of the worst times in their lives, and it would pull them through.
Yeah. And if you think about it, Jesus was also mistreated by religious folks when his faith community pretty much treated him terribly as well. So he can identify, and that's what was so precious to me when I was coming out of it. I recognized, it talks about in Philippians the fellowship of his sufferings, and I always thought that meant suffering for the sake of the gospel. But when I was suffering my worst, it was like he was there with me in it, and that I realized is the fellowship of his sufferings. It's like you get to know him better than you ever would have if you hadn't suffered. So
yeah, and Tammy says the most loving thing you can do is leave, so you do not get in the Lord's way of either helping him or dealing with him. And I absolutely agree with that, because I think sometimes by staying, we're trying to control the situation, right? So rather than handing your spouse over to God and letting God control your spouse, you're saying, no, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to control. And sometimes we do have to hand them over to God and let God do that work that needs to be done. And then we can step apart and do the work that we need to do for ourselves.
Yeah. So Tina says, the wise counselors I have now tell me to always seek wise counsel. I was a little late. I wish I knew back then what I know now, and why I desire to be an advocate for women once I'm healed. I want to know God, and I know he will use this for good. Mm-hmm. And isn't that the truth? And so we do have an advocacy program at Call to Peace Ministries, and I would say 2/3 of the participants are survivors of abuse, and God will use your story and redeem it. So Tiffany, tell us a little bit about what the isolation of living in domestic violence was like for you.
Well, and I'm sure everyone here can probably agree. I think the isolation in a domestic violence relationship is probably the loneliest you will ever feel in your life. It's just like a black hole. There is really nothing that you can do to explain it unless you've experienced it. There's no love. There's no feeling of belonging. There's no feeling of safety. There's no sense of home. It's just empty, and it's awful. I mean, even being a single person and being outside of a relationship and being on your own is not as lonely as being in a marriage where you're supposed to be protected and loved and cared for, and it's the complete opposite. You're hated and despised and treated with contempt. It's just an awful feeling.
Yes, it is. And they cut you off from all your support systems. I hear some noise in the background. I'm not sure what that is. But anyway, so talking about isolation, that was a lead in, because we're going to talk about the isolation that has occurred here during COVID. So let's talk about some of the side effects of the increased isolation that shelter in place has had on victims of domestic abuse and their children.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, I mean, the fact that we're starting to kind of get back, and, stores are opening and workplaces are opening and all that. But initially back in March, when everything went completely shut down, workplaces were closed, daycares were closed. I mean, everything was closed for the most part, unless you were deemed essential. Schools were closed. So, if you went to work, if you were a victim of domestic violence, or if you were a child subject to child abuse, school was a refuge for you. Work was a refuge for you. Those were no longer places that you could go to get away, to take a breath. You were now stuck at home 24 hours a day, typically now with your abuser. work was no longer a place where the abuser could go to get that person out of the house. Now you're stuck, all day long, 24 hours a day with that person. So I think that increases the isolation. I think that the abuser being in the home, that gives them more control over who you can see, who you can't see. And with coronavirus and all the restrictions in the CDC guidelines, they can use coronavirus to their advantage to say, you can't go outside, you can't visit with other people. You're going to infect us, you're going to infect our child, to keep the victim further isolated. Even for reasonable things that they may be able to go out and do, no, you can't do that because of coronavirus. And so they use it to their advantage to further isolate, either even from family or maybe going to the grocery store periodically. I think also because of there's increased anxiety when abusers are not in control. So you've got all these governmental restrictions. Maybe they have a loss of job. So anytime they experience a loss of control, then it always exacerbates or escalates their controlling behavior. So it makes it even worse for the victim and the children at home, and even pets. Pets have experienced the brunt of the abuse too. There was a story, I can't remember where it was, of a child, and of course this would be both parents, but child abuse has increased during coronavirus too, where there was a child once school closed down, that they locked him in the shed outside because couldn't deal with him. So, children are definitely suffering. And I think the other thing that we have to be mindful of is, as women, I'm not going to use the word victims, but the more stressed out or the more controlling our spouse becomes, the more stressed out we become. And in part, that affects our ability to parent too. So whether we want to recognize that or not, a lot of times we do take that out on our children. So we become short in our temperaments. So our children really begin to feel the brunt from both parents, when normally they could really trust maybe mom to be the more affectionate, soothing parent. Now mom is becoming testy over time. Usually there's an increase in alcohol consumption. I mean, we've heard about that just with normal people. I hate to use the word normal, but it just, in every household, you're hearing about alcohol consumption increasing because people are depressed. I mean, we're just not happy right now. We are meant to be social creatures, right? We need fellowship and we need to be together. And when that can't happen, we resort to other resources to try to fill us up. And so alcohol is on the rise. And when that happens, abuse also increases. And then you see like therapy, for example, everything's gone online. So, and with the abuser being at home, you can't necessarily get online with your therapist and talk to them. There can't be an outlet for you because they can see everything or hear everything you're saying. Can't get on the computer and research things because they can see everything you're doing. So, I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. When they're over you, hovering over you constantly, you're just completely isolated.
Yeah. So, and this is part of the reason we're here, is because Call to Peace Ministries is doing a campaign to help survivors. We have an emergency fund that helps with crisis needs. And I mean, we've had a huge spike in requests for help. We have an online support group with over 400 people in it, and local support groups here and some across the country. And so our goal for the month was to raise $20,000. And I'm starting to think, I was telling somebody the other day, I'm not sure 20,000 is going to touch it at this point, because we've got so many people. And I believe that at the end of this COVID, as we're coming out of it, you're going to see a lot more separations. We saw emergency separations that happened in the midst of it with ladies in our group. They had to leave, like they had to get out to save their lives. And then we saw many of the women that we've been serving for a while who had to just work minimum wage jobs and work hourly wage jobs, and they were laid off or they couldn't go to work. So we're really grateful that you're here. Let's talk a little bit more about your practice, your law practice, and your primary focus as an attorney, because I think people will find this interesting.
Well, and I had mentioned a little bit before. So my primary focus, I would say 95% of what I do is high conflict custody and domestic violence. And then I do, there are a few attorneys in Raleigh that focus on sexual abuse. and child abuse as well. And those are very specialized areas. So if you have a situation where you have a child that you believe is suffering from sexual abuse, that needs to be handled very delicately. That is not something that you can try to take on your own, because that will go south in a bad way quickly. So that's the majority of what I do. I have a practice here with my husband, and he likes all the numbers and the finances, and I don't like that as much. So just be forewarned, if you contact my office and you want me for your property distribution and complex financials, that's not my strong point. My strong point is really custody and domestic violence, and that's what I like to do.
And we know that's a huge issue. And you talk about the sexual abuse. I have actually seen where abusers who were not sexually abusing their children, after separation, start that. I mean, I feel like it's a punishment towards the victim, and the courts don't get it, because we know that if a woman claims abuse against her children, many times that actually backfires against her when she goes to court. And they think that she's using that as a way to alienate the children from the dad, and then he ends up getting equal custody, or sometimes even primary.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very much needed specialty. So there are some questions popping up here in our chat about the courts. We know that the courts have been closed here for a while, and I don't know if they've said anything about reopening. And what can you tell us about the courts, at least here in our area? Of course, it's going to vary from state to state.
Yeah, it's going to vary definitely from state to state. I know a lot of courts are closed across the nation. And what I can say about our court system is basically Justice Beasley made an announcement, I want to say it was on March 13th. And effectively, the courts were completely, I don't want to use the word completely, the courts were closed pretty much the next day on March 14th. So we've been basically shut down for the last over 2 months. And we're not set to reopen again until June 1st. And we are not going to reopen as normal. I don't know if the court system will operate normally again for a long time. And that's actually very scary for me as a custody attorney. What has been operating is, so they are doing emergency custody, and they are doing domestic violence protective orders. But one of the ways victims of domestic violence have been kind of further isolated, and what I've been seeing is, usually you can go into like a domestic violence shelter, Interact, something like that, and you can file for a protective order through these nonprofit agencies. Many of these nonprofit agencies have closed down, or not closed down, but they're not offering those services. So the services are limited right now. So the only way that you can file for a protective order is actually to go to the courthouse. And so they have very limited hours, even though they're offering domestic violence protective orders and emergency orders, they have very limited hours to do that. And what I have personally seen is, when I go down there, there are very few people filing for emergency custody or for domestic violence protective orders right now, in part because I don't think they know that they're available, but they still are. And so if you are in a domestic violence relationship, there are a lot of women who don't even know that they can file for protection. I didn't know when I left my spouse back in 2008, even though I was going to law school, that you could file for protection. But there is an order you can file for that is a no contact order. Essentially, it's free of charge, and it will prohibit your abuser from having any contact with you whatsoever. And if they do, then he'll be arrested. But basically, the courts are set to reopen June 1st, but everything basically is moving to like a Zoom platform or an online platform. So all calendar calls, temporary hearings, short hearings of that nature, everything is moving to online. And so I object to that as an attorney for custody hearings. I think there's a problem with having custody hearings on Zoom like this, like Facebook Live. I think there's a lot that's missed. Nonverbal cues, like you can't see anything beneath here, but you can't see if I'm taking this seriously, if I'm, what kind of behavioral messages might be missed. And so, I would object to custody hearings on Zoom, but they're kind of moving in that format. Permanent hearings will be live, but they are moving to a more like online format. And then child support hearings won't reopen again until June 22nd. So, I think there are definitely, in cases that are more nuanced and complicated and fragile, this is going to pose a problem. for some people, especially if you're uncomfortable being in front of a camera. It's hard enough being in a courtroom. So for an abusive spouse, narcissistic spouse who kind of loves seeing themselves on camera and is comfortable being at home, they may have an advantage, in an online setting. So those are some of the things that are coming up with courts. They are expected in North Carolina to reopen June 1st, but they're not going to be normal.
And I had a woman in our online group who said that the sheriff's department wouldn't even deliver the protective order. And I know that wasn't in North Carolina, but because of COVID, they would not serve the papers. So we've seen all sorts of impacts, legal court kinds of impacts because of COVID. And, it's going to take an awful long time for them to get caught up. And like you say, it's going to be operating differently in the future. The good news for that, if it's on an online format, I remember I've sat in court multiple times with victims of abuse and waited and waited and waited. At least now you can be doing something around the house.
It's true. Well, one of the things you're required to do is you have to notify the case coordinator like 24 hours in advance and then send them all your exhibits for the hearing. Yeah. So if you don't do that, they're going to continue your case again. And so they already have a backlog of cases because all the cases from March through June, they pretty much continued automatically. You had no say or control over what your new trial date would be. So they have this massive backlog, and then doing everything online is also going to slow down the process for hearings. So there's going to be more of a backlog. And if you know anything about Wake County courts, they already operate pretty slowly to begin with. So if you have an issue, like that's another thing, all the cases getting continued, there have been a lot of issues with modification of custody or custody that need to get heard. They may not be emergencies, but you have a narcissistic parent that's causing problems or is abusing, COVID related issues, and you need to get into court and you can't. So that's a problem.
Yeah, it is. So let's talk a little bit about the statistics, what they're showing about COVID. I mean, I know that I've read it depends on the area really, but I've read between a 30 and a 40% increase in domestic abuse, like in calls to domestic violence hotlines. Anything else that you want to add to that?
So obviously it's going to take a while for all the numbers to come out. It can take months and years for them to really know the true effects of coronavirus and domestic violence. But what they do know is they've looked at studies from before. So other pandemics, other major catastrophic events that have occurred in history, and they've been able to go back and look and see that there has been a increase in domestic violence during those events. So they're projecting that we're going to see the same thing during this pandemic. What they are seeing, there are a couple projects that are out there that have actually looked and have determined in some of the major cities in the United States. And their funding rates are different internationally versus nationally. But in the United States, they found that actually crime rates have gone down. And so they thought that there would be a similar decline with domestic violence. What they're actually finding is that even though the number of calls or the number of incidents of domestic violence may have gone down in some cities, what they're finding is the lethality of domestic violence is increasing. So they're not getting maybe the number of typical calls that they would, but the number of victims that are being killed is increasing. So the dangerousness or the amount of violence is actually going up. And if you actually look at the statistics in North Carolina, there were 10 victims of domestic violence, 10 homicides, murders last year in North Carolina from March to current. This year we have 19. So they have increased.
Yeah.
So that's something to be noted. And it makes sense with people being isolated at home, drinking more, and just the anger just completely getting out of control, that would be a factor.
Yeah, I think they hate the loss of control, and so somebody telling them what to do makes them angry, and then they take it out on the people. Well, it doesn't make them angry, they choose to be angry. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So for all of these reasons, and we've got a lot of comments and questions I want to get to, but we want to talk a little bit about our May Day campaign, because we are working with hundreds of victims who have been impacted some way or the other through COVID, and either financially displaced or damaged, or I don't know which the word I'm looking for, hurt, harmed because of COVID, or they are actually have been put more in harm's way. And yeah, they do tend to get more violent. I read something about Hurricane Katrina on some site saying that there was such a spike in physical abuse. So in a situation like yours, which you might not call physical, but I say punching holes in the wall is physical abuse. It's just letting you know you're next if you don't get in line. But they were saying up to 98% increase in marriages that were just had emotional, or just it's not a just, but who had emotional abuse that then became physically abusive. So we do have this campaign going on, and I know that you wanted to do a challenge to.
Yes.
So I wanted to just let you tell us what you've got here.
Okay. Well, and one of the other things I love about Called to Peace, which I didn't mention before, is that it's completely nonprofit. So all the services that are available to victims of domestic violence are 100% paid for. They're free. And so that they depend on support from donors, and whether that support is $5 or if you can give more, all of that goes directly back to the women and children and men that they support. And sometimes, just like in my case, when I left on February 28, 2008, I needed to get out, and I needed to get out now. And I didn't have anything. Like, I had my car, my keys, and my purse. That's all I had. And so they help assist women who maybe need a hotel, or they need to be able to pay rent for the month, or they need to buy food for their children, or whatever it is. And so this goes towards the Mayday campaign goes to the emergency fund, this is a true emergency. Like, I need to get out now, or I left and I need something to help me get through for the next day or two or a month or whatever it might be. And so what I'd like to offer is a matching donation of $500. And Joy, you can help me out with this because you do the matching donations all the time, but I'm putting up $500. So if anybody's willing to match that, or we can get up to that, I don't know, Joy, you can explain how that works, but I'm putting forward $500 towards the Mayday campaign.
Right. So anything you do, let's do for maybe the next 24 hours, anybody that gives any donation up to $500, it can be matched. And we will update you on our total. We are right now about $4,200 short of our goal for the month. And, as I said, I really actually I thought that, that would be a sufficient amount, but the way that we are seeing an increase, and I know that your husband, Richard, sits on our emergency fund committee, and he can tell you, I don't know, we had maybe just 3 requests last week. And so, $20,000, if you had that many requests coming in every week, that wouldn't go very long. It wouldn't last very long. And of course, we limit the amount where we try to just help them with a month worth of utility bills, transportation costs, emergency needs like that. We also have helped people with emergency hotel stays and things like that. But we definitely are in great need because we have so many people who've actually already exhausted a lot of other options. So we won't just give money out to people. We look and see what they've done to help themselves first, and we only pay to the vendors usually. And so anyway, if you guys see it in your hearts to give, it is a great need right now because of what's happening because of COVID. So there are some questions I'd love to get to. If you can see them down there in the chat, we'll just start. I can ask the question and I'll let you answer.
And don't forget, if any donation over $250, you get an autographed signed book by Joy Forrest herself.
There you go. And I will send either the book or the Call to Peace Companion workbook. So the book is a great, it's written to victims of abuse, but it's good for people helpers because it talks about the dynamics of abuse, and it talks about how our thinking changes over time. So it helps people to see what domestic abuse looks like. I mean, we talk about the false repentance and everything, and you know that I lived that. And we also have the workbook that goes along with the book that we use in our support groups, and we would definitely be willing to donate one of those as well. So with any donation over 250. So thank you. All right, let's get to these questions if we could. Can a custodial parent legally move away to another state in search of a better job when the non-custodial parent cut them off financially for over a year and there's not been child support of any kind?
So we had that question last night on the support group. So that's a complicated question. And the answer is sometimes yes, and the answer is sometimes no. If the non-custodial parent who's cut them off doesn't object to them moving or consents to them moving or is basically absent from the child's life or the other parent's life and really has no contact, you're probably okay with moving without them filing for emergency custody or motion for status quo or something like that. But it's always best to try to file a motion to relocate and get permission from the court before you move. And I'm speaking specifically for North Carolina, but generally, domestic laws vary across the United States, but generally speaking, most states have an emergency custody statute. And so if you just leave with your child and you go to another state without the consent of the other parent, they can file emergency custody against you. And while the courts can't force you to move back, they can force your child to come back. And if you don't bring the child back, you are subject to arrests. You also could be putting your child in jeopardy that the court could actually switch custody completely and give custody to the non-custodial parent. That's a complicated question. In any situation like that, I would advise you to contact an attorney and get some personalized advice before you make that decision. And I wouldn't just make that decision based on the minute or two that we discussed it here or online.
Amen. Okay, so a couple of questions we might have already answered. How are the courts working while they're closed? And you've already talked about that. Do you think that how do you think they will prioritize cases when they reopen? And then what are you seeing as far as calendar adjustments because of COVID?
Yeah, and so let me just, one thing I didn't say, so the courts are closed for hearing cases, but the courts actually are open. So you can file things if you have a consent order. So if you come in an agreement on something, you need a judge to sign it, you can drop it off, you can have it signed. So they're open for limited things. But they're not open to hear cases all day long like they normally are. And they're only open right now to drop things off or to get things signed from 1 to 5. For domestic violence protective orders and emergency hearings, they're open in the morning. So it's complicated, and you probably need an attorney to help you navigate that or get some really good advice from someone in the courthouse. And then what are you seeing with calendar adjustments because of COVID? So again, everything has been moved from March to June to new court dates. And right now I'm seeing, my cases are getting moved to September and October right now. And I expect that the calendar is so full even in September and October, a lot of my cases in September and October are gonna end up getting bumped because there's so much in September and October already. So what was originally scheduled in March is now gonna go to September, will now be in probably February, something like that. So you're looking at 6 months to a year, I think, of a delay due to the closing of the courts due to coronavirus. I think that was the question.
Yeah. What's the best type of evidence to collect in situations where there's little to no physical violence?
So there's lots of great evidence to collect. So take pictures of things. So if there's any, even though we said physical violence, what does that mean? Does that mean they've just put their hands on you? Or does it mean, has he been punching holes through walls or damaging furniture? Things like of that nature. If he has, take pictures of it. Even if it occurred 5 years ago, take a picture of it. Even if you patch the hole in the wall, take a picture of the patch of the hole in the wall. Phone records, like if he texts you or calls you incessantly. I have a case where the husband texted the wife 452 times a day to find out where she was, what she was doing, why she wasn't texting him back, that kind of thing. Get your phone records. Everything you put in writing, everything he puts in writing is evidence. So be mindful of what you're putting in writing. But collect your text, keep your emails, cards, anything that's in writing, collect all of that, keep a journal. So anytime your kids have a birthday party or they're involved in sports or they have an event and you attend, but he doesn't, write it down. Those are some things. You can also contact my office. So, and I'll write in my email right here, and I will send you my list of best evidence to collect in a custody case.
Great.
And I just have a list. There's my email. Just feel free to email me and I'll send that to you.
One thing I have suggested to women in the past is to actually record conversations. In North Carolina, it's legal to record a conversation as long as you're part of it. That's not true in every state, so you need to find out about your state laws. But in most states, it seems to be the case as long as you're part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can be on the phone or you can be in the room or wherever it is, as long as you're there, you can record the conversation. Just don't let them know you're recording it. Don't put the phone in their face or whatever. Yes, recordings are amazing because narcissists in particular are like, I'm not like that, or she's abusive, or whatever the case may be, and we have a recording to prove otherwise.
Right. What can I do if my stimulus check, and they probably filed jointly the previous year, now they're separated, but the stimulus check went into my spouse's bank account or joint account and he took it all.
Yep, that's a big problem right now. So that's going to depend. And I would probably have you contact, if you have an attorney, contact one. You can try to call the IRS. I have found that's not very helpful at all. If you have a separation agreement, if you have a court order that speaks to what's supposed to happen with your, I don't know, your tax return, potentially, you could defer to that. You could contact them and ask them for part of the stimulus money. We've tried to construct some creative ways with child support to try to get the stimulus money back. But it's turned out to be a situation where, for the most part, the other person's keeping the money and we're having a real hard time getting it back, because by the time you file a lawsuit to try to get the money back, you spent more money on legal fees than you would the stimulus money anyway.
Yeah, they probably know all that too.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one that says, I got a protective order against my husband in North Carolina. The legal aid attorney who advised me told me that the order would be considered as a legal separation. Is that true?
So yes and no. So in North Carolina, you are considered legally separated the moment you physically live apart, for the purposes of remaining apart, to be physically separated, to no longer want to be in the marriage. So the ex parte order, the complaint for the motion for the DDPO, may solidify your separation date. And so that's what they might mean by that. And that's your separation date for the purposes of being legally separated. But it is not a legal separation document. There is no real legal separation document in North Carolina. There's nothing you need to file to say we're legally separated. But for establishing your date of separation, that's what they probably meant.
Okay. All right. COVID has escalated the abuse in our relationship. Should I ask my church to put him on church discipline? And you said, this is my question. I know.
Yes, Joy.
Here's the problem. I mean, certainly you can go to your church and see what they're willing, and you could say, what do you think about church discipline? I've just seen the church discipline thing backfire so many times that I'm a little hesitant. It depends on your church. If you think they've got a heart for you and that they're going to actually see it. But what happens is, a lot of times when churches go in and they do discipline, then what they do is they start we're gonna come up with a plan. We're gonna have a reconciliation plan, and we're gonna ask him to do all of these things. And abusers love checklists, so they will do everything on the checklist. And then the next thing you know, he's like, I'm repentant. He seems sorry. He might even go in with crocodile tears. He may seem extremely repentant to them, and then you not trusting him enough to take him back could actually backfire on you. And I've seen so many women undergo church discipline. So personally, I would, if it were me, and this is your decision, you always are, you need to make your own choices. But if it were me, I think that I would actually use the civil authorities, because it's against the law to abuse your wife, especially physical, abuse. But there's a statute in North Carolina. You can tell us what the statute says and what defines domestic abuse. It's actually not all physical in our definition.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's bodily injury or attempted bodily injury. It could also be stalking, sexual assault, rape, and it's also continued harassment that rises to the level to inflict substantial emotional distress, which basically means, he is created such a hostile environment for you that you just really can't take it anymore. You're sleepless, insomnia, headaches, sick to your stomach. feel like you're, jumpy all the time, that kind of thing. So that's the statute, domestic violence. It's 50B in North Carolina.
And I think, sorry, I keep hearing these weird noises. So anyway, I think that a lot of times once you get a protective order, then the church is a lot more likely to come along behind you, because a lot of times another thing churches want to do is they want to substantiate that there was actual abuse. But if you've got a protective order that's been given to you by civil authorities, then that means that you have substantiated the abuse already, and then they're much more likely to come alongside you, I think. I mean, that's what I have found in my years of experience working with this. And then my church, the next question is, my church says I shouldn't file anything in court because he's trying. It's risky. Is it risky to delay filing the protective order? My question for you is, are you afraid? I don't think that you should be living in fear. And do you think that he could do you harm? You really need to assess your level of safety. And there's something called a lethality index, a mosaic lethality index. You can go online and take that. And if you have, even one or two of those, then those are indications that it could be more lethal. And I have seen domestic abuse go from emotional, like Tiffany's. Like for me, I was in that relationship 11 years before it crossed the line to physical, but it can cross it just like that. And so if you're living in fear, then I would definitely encourage you to consider the protective order. And especially if you've done that lethality index, at the very least, go see an advocate or try to talk to an advocate at your local domestic violence agency. So anything?
Two things. One, about the church discipline, just make sure if you decide you're going to pursue that you're safe. If there are still COVID restrictions in place and you can't leave the house, it's not something you probably want to be asking your church for right now, because then you're subject to his anger once he gets home and finds out about it. So just be real, assess your safety before you do something like that right now. And then sometimes waiting to file a protective order can be harmful, because the defense will make an argument that you were not in fear, or you were not in danger, so that you waited all this time, so there's not a big deal. But you also need to time when you file the protective order appropriately, because there needs to be something happening right now that puts you at imminent risk before you file it. So otherwise it'll get denied.
Right. Yeah. Because if you wait 2 months later after you've had a big incident, they're going to go, well, then why didn't you file then?
Right.
So yes, and I've seen that multiple times. Here's a comment. My husband violated the protective order in May and I had him arrested. Original court date was the end of May. It has been put off twice and no actual date, just an extension. Yeah. There's just an example of what's happening with the courts right now.
That's true. That's common though with criminal cases, that they would get put off like that. The one thing I'll say about criminal cases or versus the civil, so domestic violence protective orders are civil, criminal arrests are criminal, is a lot of times criminal orders will actually have different no contact provisions in them than the DVPOs will. So it'll maybe they can have no contact with you or your children, and they have to be within a certain yardage of you, whereas the DVPO may allow contact with the children. The criminal order is going to trump. So you might want to find out what the criminal order contains. Like the bond release will have provisions in there that say he can't have any contact with you or the kids. And if he's violating that, I would let the DA's office know.
Yeah. So the next question is for you, Tiffany. You said you had to wait until your children were 18 to share your story because of the court order. Now that they are 18, is there anything your ex could do to hurt you legally as you share?
I think so. I think he could threaten defamation, which is that big word everybody threatens. But in order for it to be defamation, it has to be untrue. And everything I'm talking about is completely true. So I'm not real worried about that.
Yeah, that's what they asked me when I wrote my book. And I said, well, I have lots and lots of witnesses. And I mean, there's court records and everything else. So I think that as long as you can prove your case, yes. Mm-hmm. And then Naomi says there's a clarification to a question. If there's already a court-ordered agreement between two couples who are separated and they share custody between two couples, I think she just means couples, and they share custody of the minor child, what does the parent who wants to move to another state need to do if she already has almost 70% physical custody of the child? I would still think the answer would be the same. That
Generally
basically,
speaking, well, I mean, it depends on what state you want to move to, too. Like, if you want to move to South Carolina or Virginia and you can still make the custodial arrangement work, you can move, as long as you're not violating the court order. But if you want to move to New York, Florida, California, something like that, it makes it more difficult. So the answer would remain the same. I would definitely seek advice from an attorney before you leave.
yeah.
Because you could be in violation of the court order. You could also get charged with kidnapping.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're at 1 o'clock and we still have a couple. We want to just we had talked about the statistics and now the increase, and you had a little thing jotted down here. What don't the statistics show right now? So we know that there's been a rise in physical violence and lethality, at least. There has been an increase of calls to domestic violence hotlines, but what do you think that the statistics are not showing us right now during COVID?
I don't think they're going to show the increase in domestic violence right now. I don't know that there are as many women filing for protective orders, even though they're actually in, harm's way or in danger, because I don't think that they know that they can. They think the courts are closed. They don't know they can file for DVPOs. A lot of nonprofits are operating under limited hours, or they're not offering filing services. They just don't know that they can do it. But I think that there's going to, that part of the statistics are going to be skewed.
Well, and I think that they would be underreporting, because I did read that calls to do domestic violence hotlines were up 3 times higher than they have been. And I had a friend who's an advocate who had asked somebody to call the domestic violence hotline, and the woman was on hold for 45 minutes the other day. So it's still, and I do believe like these kinds of situations make it to the point where you, golly, I lost my train. So anyway, it just makes it so that people don't want to report, or if you've got an abuser home, it's a lot harder to make a plan to get out and things like that. So we really do believe that it's still being underreported. And I think that as we come out of this more and more, we're going to see the effects and the impacts even more, like you said earlier. And then,
well, and the other thing too, Joy, I mean, one thing the controller instills fear in the victim. I think the other thing society and media has done a really good job of with coronavirus in general is instilling fear. So, a victim may not want to leave her abusive partner because she's afraid if she goes out there, and she goes to a shelter or anywhere else, that she could subject herself and her children to coronavirus and potentially die. So it's kind of like, this scale of, do I stay and be in this horrible situation, or do I go out in public and potentially risk the health and safety of me and my children? So right now it's just an awful time for women to have to be making these decisions.
Yeah. Somebody commented, I don't think they're showing the mental emotional effects related to the isolation and loss of community for victims and survivors. Absolutely. And I don't think they're showing the kids living in it who have lost access to primary reporters like teachers. So yeah, the
Absolutely.
radio show that I did with Chris Moles and Steve Noble and Jim Upchurch the other day, Chris said that's probably the biggest thing for him, is seeing that these kids who had access to school counselors, to Sunday school teachers, to coaches and other people in their lives now don't have eyes on what's going on in their lives and in their worlds. And so I just think we're beginning to see as we start coming out of it, but I think we're going to see more and more as we'll hear more and more stories as time goes on, and people are able to move forward. And possibly, I think there are probably going to be a lot more separations after this, because they will have realized, it was like for me, my ex-husband worked, he was an emergency room physician, and he would work out of town. So he'd be gone half the weekend. So it was fine. And then he quit one of his jobs and was home way more often. He had actually 2 hospitals where he was working. And so that was not good for our marriage when he was home more. So I can understand that, because there's something to pick on all the time and you can't do anything right, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I don't see any other questions in here. If you got any more, we need to get them quickly. And remember, there's a delay between our broadcast and what comes on Facebook. We can also answer you in the Facebook comments. So just thank you, Tiffany, for joining us. And thank you. Tiffany's doing a $500 donation for the next 24 hours. If you donate up to a $500 is going to be matched. And If you donate over 250, then you're going to get a personalized, you can either get the Call to Peace book or the workbook. I'll sign it and I'll even write whatever you want me to write in it. So one more question. Did you get this one? My church says I shouldn't file anything. Yes, we already answered that one. So we're good to go. So guys, if you see it in your heart, we're still short. We are almost $5,000 short of our goal to raise 20,000 for our emergency fund to help people who have been impacted by domestic abuse and the I guess the amplified effects of domestic abuse because of COVID. So if you would see it in your heart to donate, we will put it in the description here on Facebook, and we would really appreciate you coming alongside. I could just sit here and tell you stories all day about the people who have reached out. I can tell you one of the ladies that we help is got twins, and she's an in-home childcare worker. Well, stay at home completely knocked out all of her income, and her ex actually is in jail for assaulting her. So we've had to help her with her bills. We've got other women whose kids are no longer in school, so they're having to pay for childcare, and by the time they pay for childcare, they can't even afford to go to work. Really, it's just. So we have all sorts of situations going on like this where we're having to come alongside. We had a person who's a nail technician who could not, found a job at a local grocery store as a cashier, but it doesn't pay as well. So there just are multitudes of reasons that we're having to activate and use our emergency fund. So if you would have the heart to come alongside, we would really, really appreciate it. And Tiffany, got anything else you want to say in closing?
Just feel free to post in the support group. I'm happy to answer some more questions if you have any more. You can always reach out to my office. It's my mom's birthday this weekend though, so it might take me a few days to get back to you. So.
Happy birthday, Mom.
Yeah.
All right, one more question. Is it required for the victim to have an amicable biblical relationship between the abuser when he is requesting for them both to meet up with his choice of two accountability partners? I don't think that's a good idea. Personally, I find that most of victims of abuse that I work with have complex PTSD, and any time it puts a hamper on your healing process, not until you have reached that point where you're no longer triggered by him. If you're still being triggered, I just think that no contact or very low contact is the best, because what he's going to do is use this to manipulate you and the two accountability people probably. So I would suggest you work on your own healing for a while, and just try to keep it to low to no contact. And if you decide to do something like that, then you want to make sure that one of those accountability people, again, I don't recommend that, but if it's your decision always. If you decide to do that, then I would find somebody that gets domestic abuse, an advocate. So anyway, all right. I think that's it. And this is our last live that I know of for the month, unless we are really desperate and we still have to get back on here on like the 31st. But thank you so much for your matching challenge. And thank you for all the information about the courts and legal issues. And we really appreciate you just being a part of our team here at Call to Peace Ministries. It's a blessing.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. All right.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye.